Well, I'm absolutely delighted that we get to have Israel Borokini as our speaker this year, even though it didn't quite work out to have him here in person. I mean, he could have had another dose of snow if he'd come. I first met him at a California Botanics CMPS conference in LA, where he was giving a talk on his PhD research on conservation issues of Ivesea weberi. And since I'd spent much of my career on Ivesea, it was logical for us to check out each other. Found out later, it actually, I mean, part of the appropriateness of him as a speaker is he was one of our recipients of the Idaho Native Plant Society ERIG grant in 2019, which allowed him to go to Northern Idaho to collect more Ivesea, tweedii, and he's done a lot of work further on Iveseas. But that's just a tiny portion of everything he's done. And the more I learned about him, the more I'm saying, wow, we need to get this guy as a speaker up in Idaho. We debated after getting him, should we have him talk on his current research on niche modeling in Ivesea and other rare plants, or maybe ethnobotany of Nigeria. And I finally realized, you know, he's got such an interesting career path. Let's just have him talk about himself. And he was fortunately willing to accept that challenge. And I'm not sure how much more introduction I should do and how much he's going to include himself, but he's got, you know, just reading in this one report from the Jepson Globe, how, you know, growing up in his teen years in a forest estate with hiking through dense tropical jungle, seeing packs of monkeys hopping around, going to bed with the barking of wild dogs. Then did his employed at the National Center for Genetic Resources and Biotechnology in Ibadan, Nigeria. He's published about 60 research papers at that time, especially on ethnobotany and traditional knowledge diffusion, invasive species management, and distribution of endemic flora in Nigeria, papers that have been cited almost 700 times, probably more by now, but at least that was then. He loves traveling and soaking in hot springs. So hopefully we'll get him up in Idaho next year or something. So welcome, Israel, and everybody, please be sure to mute yourself and recommend turning your video off as well. And let's, Israel, go with it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barbara, for this introduction. I will need sharing access. I can share my slide. But while doing that, I really appreciate this wonderful opportunity to be with you. Thank you so much for the grant I received a couple of years back, which gave me the opportunity to travel all the way to Northern Idaho, about maybe 40-50 miles from Canadian border, to collect the tweedii, and I met amazing people, very loving, welcoming, and kind people who helped me all the way with my PhD. I said CMPS 2018 was the best conference I've had so far, because that was when I first met Barbara, and we had highly stimulating, thought-provoking conversations, which actually helped me with my research, my PhD work. So thank you very much, everyone, for this opportunity. Still waiting for me to be able to share my screen for the slide.
You should be able to share now, Israel. Go ahead.
It says host participant disabled person screen sharing.
Can you just allow screen sharing for everybody?
You should be able to make him co-host as well. He'll be able to present.
There we go. Now it works. All right. Yeah, and thanks for that introduction. That actually takes away a couple of my slides. Yeah, so I was asked to give a talk on just a relaxed, low-key introduction of storytelling, I would call it, of my unconventional career journey from warm tropical to cold desert ecosystems. Currently, I'm a postdoctoral scholar at the Department of Integrated Biology at University of California, Berkeley. I actually graduated from University of Nevada, Reno, just south of Idaho. So just to start with, to tell you my identity, I'm Black. I'm born in Nigeria in West Africa. Nice to meet you, Rabiu. This is awesome. I look forward to seeing you one of these days. Actually got my naturalized US citizen. So, and then I'm the first generation in my family to have master's and to have PhD. And actually to do that outside of my home country. I've not seen my family since 2013. Yeah, I'm a scientist and I'm from the Yoruba tribe in Nigeria, which is the third largest tribe in Africa, and thinking of which one is the first, which one is the second. The Hausa tribe is the second largest tribe in Africa, which Rabiu belongs to. Speaking of Nigeria, Nigeria is the 7th most populous country in the world. It's the most populous in Africa with over 200 million people and over 500 languages. The 3 major ones are Hausa, Igbo, and Yoruba languages. I can only speak Yoruba language, which is my tribal language. I cannot speak others, and I don't understand theirs. And that is why English is more or less like the universal language that everybody goes to school speaks English. And it's the official language for the country. Some other fun facts about Nigeria. Nigeria has the highest frequency of monozygotic twins in the world, the largest economy in Africa, and in terms of film industry, is the 2nd largest in the world, only second to Bollywood, which means the Nigerian film industry is even larger than Hollywood itself. That's how interesting it is. And so the pictures here, the very first one shows the Yoruba people, the culture, the dressing, the dancing. The one in the middle is the Hausas. And the one on the right is the Igbo. The moment you see those red caps, it tells you that this is Igbo people. So it all started for me in this institute called Cocoa Research Institute of Nigeria, where my dad worked for 35 years. And they have a very large, expansive research campus where not just the buildings for offices and research, but also residential quarters for all of their staff. And they have more than like 3,000 staff working there at a time. So it was a lot of land and property there, about 20 miles away from Ibadan, which is a metropolis, a big city. So I lived in there for 15 years, and this staff residence and research complex was built inside a forest reserve. There's a lot of story behind that, which I don't want to go into right now. Like Barbara mentioned, which was taken from my biography. Yeah, so it was really interesting because I still have those memories of seeing monkeys jumping in the trees in broad daylight, making noise, and we were just watching them. Unfortunately, there were no smartphones in those days. I would have taken tons and tons of pictures and videos and things like that to show today. And that's a picture of me standing in front of the main entrance of that complex. This picture was probably taken in 1991 and 1992, thereabout. I actually had to, it was taken with a monograph camera that I had to just retake it to show it here. Yeah, and so I grew up in this large forest reserve where I have close encounter with nature. I start to appreciate nature. And at the same time, we begin to see over the course of the 15 years I lived in this complex with my parents and family, it got to the point where we no longer saw those monkeys jumping in the trees because of increased poaching and deforestation. even though it was inside a protected area, there was a lot of illegal activities going on there. A lot of people were interested in bush meat. And so people were going out there, hunters going to kill those animals and sell them. And people were buying them for big ceremonies and things like that. And so it all started for me here. And so it was only natural for me to go to university to go and study botany, and which I did. And in Nigeria, the way education system runs is that for you to graduate with bachelor's degree, you have to do some research. So I did the research which focused on common garden experiments with cowpea, which was one of the native plants in West Africa. And but unfortunately, my hunger for knowledge was not satisfied. That was the very first time I started to have a lot of criticism against Nigerian education. There was a lot of strike actions by the university staff, sometimes for 8 months, sometimes for 6 months, and it was very bad. And there was not a lot of lecturers around teaching classes, so many classes were not taught. I remember graduating from my department, and I wrote a strong petition against that department because of so many things they did not teach us. And people are like, who is this guy? What's wrong with him? And it was so weird and bizarre for somebody to do that. And because of that, I just lost interest in the education system, and I just wanted an overseas education. But I couldn't get offers at that time. It was really, really hard. Internet was, in fact, by the time I was graduating my bachelor's degree, there was nothing like internet. We were just going to libraries to go and read books to write our thesis. So I guess I've become old enough to be able to say that. Eventually, a couple of years after I graduated from university, I got a job at the National Center for Genetic Research and Biotechnology, which was a major milestone or step in my career choice. The institute had a national mandate for conservation of Nigerian biodiversity. Something similar to it I can think of in the US right now would be the US Fish and Wildlife Service, but I do a lot of more research and management of the gene banks. I was traveling across the country collecting germplasms of plants that were threatened or almost going to extinction, and protecting them in our gene banks. And that was when I started to do research. That was in 2008 when I was hired. That was when I started doing independent research work outside of my university work. And so, because the mandate of that center was so broad, my research focus also was really broad. At the time I was hired, I was the only botanist in that institute. Others were like agriculture-related experts. I was the only pure botanist hired there. So I was in charge of the herbarium, and I had to do a lot of plant-related studies, but they all have to have a conservation angle. So that was when I delved into natural resource use. And this is because IUCN estimation of threats or assessment of threats to species, which is more like the global standards being used, made us understand that up till today, the greatest threat to species globally is habitat destruction and loss. Habitat destruction and loss is still the most severe threat or risk for species to today. But in specific regions or continents, there are some other threats that are more severe. For example, in highlands, invasive species is the greatest threat or risk for species in island systems. In Africa, as an example, species overexploitation is the greatest threat to biodiversity in that region. And so my focus was and a lot of people were using plants for food, for medicine, and several other ecosystem services. So I became more and more interested in documenting what kind of plants do people use for what illness, and how often do they collect these plants. And in fact, we have very large herbal markets where people can get, we can go to those stores, to those big markets and buy different plant materials, whether in raw form or those that have been packaged or prepared in some drug form. So we have all of these systems. So there's a lot of demand for plant products, barks of trees, different leaves, dry and fresh, different seeds of varieties of plants. So I was more interested not only in documenting the importance of the medicinal efficacies of those plants, but also the conservation angle. What is the frequency of those herbal harvesters going out there to go and harvest the plants? How rare are those plants? How often do they encounter those plants in natural systems where they go to harvest those plants? And then, of course, what are the phytochemical components of those plants that support their medicinal use for specific treatment? So I did a lot of work on that. I did several other studies, which I will not go into details of those right now, particularly on invasive species management, biogeography, estimating which plants are more widespread, which plants are range restricted, and so on and so forth. And so, having done several of these studies, before I said, by the time I was starting my PhD, I had published 51 scientific papers, written 2 books. There were some publishers who contacted me asking me to publish some of my work as a book and not just as a paper. So they sponsored that, and so I got 2 books published, 2 scientific proceedings where I was one of the co-editors, and 1 citable data publication. I attended about 22 conference meetings and gave presentations there, and also listed 2 species in a tree species in IUCN Red List of threatened species, and so on. So these are some of the work I had done as of 2015, before at the time I was starting my PhD, and this slide gives you a good example of some of the work I published on invasive species, on conservation angle of different plant species across the entire West African region, or particularly related to Nigeria system. So you can read a lot more about my work, particularly on Google Scholar. My Google Scholar page has all of my publications and links to download them, or on ResearchGate, or you can go on my website and read more about the work as well. So one thing I would like to say, though, is when I started my PhD, I had my CV was about 15 pages long, and so we're like, wow, who is this guy who has a CV of 15 pages long and is just starting his PhD? And so it was really, really interesting. But on close look of my work, I began to receive a little bit of criticism. Some people are asking me, like, well, some of the papers you publish are published in regional journals, or what people would consider predatory journals or something like that. And I was like, okay, well, here is the thing. As at the time I was doing all of my research, I do not have any funding to do any of my work. And it's not just me, it's majority of research work being done by many of my colleagues, including myself in Africa, currently are done self-funded. People paid for research studies out of pocket. There's nothing like getting NSF funding anywhere. There are not things, at least at the time I was doing my research, there was nothing like that. Not only do we have to, did I use my money to do the research, I also used my money to pay journal publication fees. If people talk about diversity in publication and this and that, it was only recently that people began to talk about it. As at the time I was publishing many of these papers, there was nothing like that. You submit your paper to a journal, it becomes accepted, then you have to pay like some huge amount of money to get that paper open access. There was no option. There was nothing talking. Nobody talked about diversity or equity in publication. It was these are all recent conversations. And so we were using and interestingly at that time too, I ran into problem with some of my bosses because some of them, even though they did not contribute a single dime or their intelligence or intellect or anything to the work, it is kind of a cultural thing that when you are publishing a paper, you have to include your bosses as co-authors and things like that. And I was like, well, I'm not going to do that. And then I ran into trouble with my bosses at that time. And, you know, these are cultural innuendos that got with publications, by the way. Also, there weren't Wi-Fi on campuses, on research campuses and universities. So people go to commercial internet providers to go and download papers when they have to do this kind of work. And of course, sometimes some of those papers could not be downloaded because of unless your university has a library that is subscribed to those journals. And so we could not access most papers. At least when I was there, I could not access most of the papers. There were no Wi-Fi on campuses. There were no, and many of those commercial internet providers, they were public desktops reading with viruses and malwares and things like that. Wi-Fi is usually a little bit faster at night. So I can recall most of the time I will go when I want to do a lot of literature surveys and reading and papers. I usually go overnight. I go and buy hair time. We call it hair time. You buy some data or hair time at these commercial internet providers. And I work overnight from like 10 p.m. to 5 a.m. It's usually cheaper and the Wi-Fi is usually faster at that time because the load on the Wi-Fi is not that very much. And that's how my life between 2008 and 2014, 2015 was. That was how I was carrying out research. And of course, there was no electricity that was regular at that point in time. So oftentimes people in this part of the world don't understand or don't know some of these challenges that people face for doing research in that part of the world. And that it's a wild, wild west, really, of doing research. And so when people are able to do something out of it, it's something to be encouraged, it's something to be celebrated. Yeah, I only received funding for 3 papers out of 51 that I published. Yeah. Eventually, because I got a job at a research institution, I had to do masters because I wasn't interested in Nigerian education, so I didn't go for any master's program. I was busy looking for a program outside the US, outside of Nigeria. But when I got that job in that research institution, then I decided to go for a master's program. I finished my master's in botany, with focus on plant systematics. I did a lot of work on anatomy, plant anatomy, and seeing ecological basis for phenotypic differences in plant anatomy and palynology, the pollen grains of plants, and several other studies. So I published 4 papers for my master's thesis. And again, these are all self-funded educational systems, pay for school fees with my money, pay for research, pay for traveling and all this stuff, and analysis, laboratory work, and publications. Yeah. And even though I went to a different university called the University of Idaho, which was the first, we call it the premier university, the first university in the country and one of the best, but still I wasn't satisfied. I was not happy. There was still a lot of strikes by the lecturers. There was still a lot of labor issues between the university administration and the government and the workers. So these are some of the universities I was applying to. I was particularly more interested in going to Europe or other countries where one can finish PhD within 3 years, and those were more common in Canada, Australia, or Europe. I was like, I don't want to go to the US and do a PhD for 5 years, 6 years. Yeah, I've already spent a lot of time doing that in Nigeria. I should just go at the PhD within 3 years. And so I spent a lot of time, fortune, effort, writing to those institutions, and I got admission from at least these 3 universities. DICE is in UK, Guelph is in Canada, and Leuven was the last one where I actually got an admission in Belgium. But all those ones I got admission, but I couldn't get funding, and that was the problem with those. And then I came to the US for the very first time in 2011 for a program, a training workshop organized by the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute and George Mason University. in Front Royal, Virginia, and there was some. It was even offered to me to come and do a PhD at George Mason University or Ohio State University, and I said no, I don't want. I would rather do it in Europe. I was still thinking along that direction. And there was even some people who offered it to me to stay back and not go back home. And I was like, no, I'm not going to violate my visa. I got a visa for 3 months. I should just use that visa and go back and not violate it. And people are like, well, there are a lot of people who are in this country who are illegal immigrants and nobody cares about that. So why are you worried about it? I was like, well, I can't do that. I have to go back home. Anyways, and then coming to the wild, wild west, the very first time coming to Nevada was when I was invited to be part of a project organized by the Great Basin Institute and the Nevada Department of Wildlife and BLM to do some field surveys, traveling, hiking miles and miles across the desert, looking for these poles, which were used like markers for mining sites many years ago, but have now become traps for birds and wildlife and other animals in the desert who are looking for places to cool down in the heat of the sun, and they got stuck in those poles and they could and died in there. So our job was to go look for those mines, those poles, and pull them out and collect data on mortality of birds and reptiles and other animals that died in them. And so I did that for 6 months. And then I also did some interpretive services and K-12 environmental education outreach at the Great Basin Institute, working with those different organizations there. So it was in that process that I was drawn to the program being done, the interdisciplinary PhD program being done at University of Nevada, Reno. So here is an unconventional PhD admission. So on June 2013, I came back from the desert. I came back into civilization. I had 6 days off. After 8 days being in the desert, I had 6 days off, and I was to relax before going back to the desert. And by the way, that was how I fell in love with hot springs, because we were doing a lot of hiking in the desert and came in and hiking and camping around hot springs. And so, anyways, so I just randomly walked into the office of the directors of the EECB program. They call it Ecology, Evolution, and Conservation Biology program at UNR. I just knocked on their doors in the middle of the summer. And I was like, well, I'd like to speak to you guys about your program here. And I remember the look on their face because I didn't email them earlier. I just randomly walked into the building and knocked on their doors. And I was fortunate enough, both of them were around, not out for field work. And so after having talked to the co-directors, then they encouraged me to apply, particularly Dr. Mary Peacock, who eventually became my advisor, encouraged me to apply. I haven't seen my CV and my work. In 2013, in September, I wrote the GRE test while having no time to study. In October 2013, I was offered a PhD position to start in spring of the following year. And I had to hurriedly run back home to go and get all of my documents, transcripts, and things like that. And I returned to the US in December 2013, and then I realized that, oh, the visa I have is not the appropriate one to do PhD on. I needed to transfer from a different visa to a different visa virtually. And so the admission had to be delayed until eventually I started my PhD in 2014, August of 2014. Then a very unusual PhD journey, right? And I use the word unusual because I don't want to use uncommon or unconventional too frequently in the presentation. So I was very interested in working on this plant called Okubaka obreveli, which is a tropical tree species found across West Africa. Is the largest hemiparasitic tree in the world. Studies, well, at least surveys shows that no other tree can grow with around 5 meters close to the tree because it produces some phytochemicals in the roots which kills off other trees that want to get close to it. The bark is used for a lot of medicinal uses that I'm going to mention in the coming slides. Very few stands of this tree remain across the entire West African region, and in fact, because of some supernatural powers this plant is perceived to have, it is worshipped as a sacred tree. And I did a lot of work on it when I was working at National Center for Genetic Research and Biotech to do seed regeneration and plant it in our gene bank and protect it, but it was very challenging. So a little bit about this plant in terms of cultural information about the plant. A lot of countries across West Africa, the cultures believe that there are some spirits that live in this tree and that it is the only tree that can never be struck by lightning, and that before you can collect the plant, you have to make libations and rituals before you can harvest the bark. In fact, in Ghana, it is believed that the harvester must approach the tree naked, harvest the plant, and run away before the spirit in the tree pounces on the harvester or kill the harvester. Bark harvesting is only permitted with wooden batten and never with a metal equipment, and several other cultural laws that is surrounding the protection of this tree. Like I mentioned earlier, the plant, the bark has a lot of medicinal usefulness. It's used to make homeopathic drugs, which is circulated across Europe and some parts of North America. And so there's huge demand for the bark of this tree, particularly in Germany. When I was doing my investigation or studies about this plant, there's a lot of demand for this plant in Germany for making homeopathic medicine. And almost nothing is known about the plant. I wanted to study the plant, but then I could not get funding to study the plant. So I had to give up the dream of studying the plant. And I said, well, before I give up on studying this plant, I'm going to do something that will help the plant one way or the other. And that was to list the plant in the IUCN Red List. So I got this plant listed as an endangered species. And also a sister species called Locobacca michelsonii. I got that one listed as well. Both are the two IUCN Red listings that I did. And then I moved on to study Idaho weberi. And so what happened was that as I was starting my PhD, this plant was also successfully listed as a federally threatened forb. And so it was one of the, and it was, in fact, it's the only taxa, to the best of my knowledge, the only taxa in the genus that was given that federal listing. And so, because of that, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was mandated to offer some funding to do some research on the study, because virtually no scientific publication exists for the plant. There's a lot of species surveys that have been done, taxonomic notes like the one written by Barbara on it, and several other great literature. That was all that was known about the plant, almost nothing. And here am I, somebody who has spent a good number of his life studying tropical plant species, and now in a completely different spectrum of ecosystem in the desert, having to study a plant that nobody knows anything about, and in an ecosystem that it doesn't know a lot about. And so that was my story for the past 7 years that I worked on my PhD. So my dissertation, the Fish and Wildlife Services, they wanted me to do an assessment on the genetic variation of the population of the species for them to be able to do inform their conservation strategy for the species, and also to investigate the effect of the soil seed bank, because the plant undergoes vegetative regeneration. So at the same time, it produces seeds. So they were wondering whether it does, what is the role of the seed bank on the regeneration of that species. And that was all they wanted me to do. And I was like, well, I need one more chapter. They want to do 3 chapters for PhD. I can't just do 2. And so, and instead of me looking for just one more chapter to do a 3-chapter PhD, I ended up doing 5 chapters. And so here's the thing: I was very passionate about niche modeling, about identifying what determines the niche of a species. Why are some species narrowly restricted, and why are some range restricted, and why are some widely distributed? So I was very much interested in dabbling into the niche theory and things like that. So I ended up adding one more chapter on species distribution modeling for the species. And I fitted the niche models. I said, well, nothing hurt to go out there and see whether my models are actually accurate, whether those areas that are predicted to be suitable are actually suitable. And I ended up doing that for 5 years of fitting niche models and going out to go and do field validation on those models. And I discovered 9 new locations of this species, 2 of which were discovered accidentally by some other group, but I discovered the remaining 7. And it was so interesting because the fish and wildlife people themselves, they told me, well, we've searched everywhere for this time, we couldn't find it. So why bother yourself going out there to go and look for it all by yourself in the desert? Well, where will you find it? And I ended up finding 7 new locations of the species and increased the range, the non-range for that species. And then my soil seed bank study did not turn out as I expected. So I ended up having to do more studies to understand the biology of the seeds themselves. And that was really helpful in understanding the dynamics of the soil seed bank for that species. And because of my interaction with people like Barbara and some other folks out there, particularly in the Nevada Native Plant Society, who are passionate about Ibiza and other Ibiza species, I ended up deciding to do some more studies. In fact, what led to doing some ploidy and genome size estimation for the entire genus was that I was going to use microsatellite for my study to assess the genetic variation, but then we didn't know whether the plant is diploid or polyploid. With that very basic information was lacking. We knew from the flora of North America that it was diploid, but it was written to be diploid, but some of the academic members of academic committee members were skeptical about that. They said, well, I need to test it myself. So I ended up having to do some karyotyping, and then there are some literature saying, well, that people should not do karyotyping anymore, but you can do genome size estimation. So I ended up doing that, and then I extended that study for other species or taxa within that genus, and that was what led to me traveling over 8,000 miles across the entire western region, up to the Pacific Northwest, collecting as many Ibiza taxa as I could collect, all the way to Washington State and all the way down to San Diego, collecting samples and doing genome size estimation on them, and using those genome size estimation to infer ploidy levels for the genus. I ended up collecting samples from 30 out of 38 taxa within that genus. And it is a million thanks again to the Idaho Native Plant Society for helping with the collection, with funding, part of which helped me to be able to travel to come over to collect Ibiza 2DI and enjoy the beauty of the nature in Idaho before going elsewhere when I was doing my field work. And I also did some abundance estimation, modeling, and modeling for the discrete populations of Ibiza weberi. And those are the work I did for my PhD. But looking back today, I can remember days when I was doing my PhD and in my office on campus, I would just burst into tears and I would just be crying because I was stuck. Virtually for most of these chapters I worked on. So instead of having 3 chapters, I ended up with 5 chapters and 2 additional independent chapters. So I ended up with 5 chapters, 7 chapters of research, 5 of which were published with my dissertation and 2 others on the side that I was working on for the species. But what is interesting is that I knew almost nothing about any of the methods or tools to work on this species. Like I've never done anything on population genetics before now. That was part of the reasons why I said I hated education in Nigeria, because I never took a class on population genetics when I was in the university. There was not a single class offered on that. There was not a single class offered on evolution. I remember in my undergraduate days, the professor was teaching us evolution, happened to be a priest, and he doesn't like evolution, so he turned the class into a joke, literally a joke, and almost everybody got an A for taking evolution, and that was his own way of saying we have learned evolution. And so it was really, really interesting how deficient the system was, which really affected my work. And so I remember knowing almost nothing about this. In fact, some of my academic committee members thought I wouldn't be able to succeed or finish my PhD because they thought I was not prepared for it. I had zero knowledge on most of this, and particularly on the ecology and the natural history of the desert itself and the species. I had serious financial challenges. I remember being homeless in summer of 2017. I remember there was a time I had to work at Walmart stocking shelves because I could not afford my rent because I ran out of funding. Well, not because typically they pay us for 9 months or 10 months out of 12. So the remaining 2 months you have to go fend for yourself. And as an international student, well, for local students, they can go back to their father's or their parents' house and go and stay there or get funding to stay afloat. But for some of us international students, you have to save out of the money you have paid for 10 months to be able to cover for the other 2 months. But for some reason, 2017 was a bad year, and I ended up becoming homeless. I was sleeping in my office on campus and taking shower in the laboratory in the middle of the night. I remember having to go and work for Walmart to stock shelves that very summer of 2017 to be able to eat. And it was really, really challenging. And many people don't think about this. They don't understand the challenges that people face when they have to travel thousands of miles away to go and study in a different environment. I certainly did not know about the challenges. I was just passionate about looking for overseas education. I didn't know the challenges that goes with it. But here am I today. I graduated my PhD, completed 5 dissertation chapters. I published 2 papers by the time I was graduating, and others in advanced stage of publication. One day I was looking at the list of all the alumni of the EECB program, and I realized that, to the best of my understanding, maybe I'm wrong, I don't know, but to the best of my understanding, I was the first Black to finish PhD in that program. I finished my PhD, graduated in the middle of the pandemic, and they were asking me, do you want a virtual graduation or you want in person? I said, I want in person because I want to celebrate myself. And so I had an in-person graduation. I bought an $800 worth of regalia, and I just wanted to celebrate myself for that. But in the middle of doing all of this, of doing research, there was still a lot of communication with people back home. I remember being invited to represent Nigeria in the United Nations IPBES program. We're just finishing that assessment of the sustainable use of wild species. In fact, we're just finishing that assessment currently, and there's going to be a plenary session 9 in Germany this summer to endorse that assessment. It was more than 3 years of work on that, while also working on my PhD. I remember also being invited to represent Nigeria on an ad hoc technical expert group on invasive species management in the CBD program, and also having a lot of leadership roles in different professional societies, one of which is being the president for the Africa section for Society for Conservation Biology. And my tenure as the president is going to be ending in December this year, when I'll be happy I can get that load off my neck, because a lot of work having to hold those leadership positions, and especially being thousands of miles away and having to meet with people in Africa, especially virtually. And for them, it is evening, and for me, it is early in the morning, like 5 a.m. or 6 a.m. or 7 a.m., having to wake up to attend those kind of virtual meetings. And currently, what am I doing right now? I'm on a 2-year postdoctoral fellowship, which is funded by the Cedar Tree Foundation. It's called the David Smith Fellowship, Conservation Research Fellowship. Basically, it's within the department of, my host is Dr. Brent Mishler, or my mentor, who is the director of the University of Jefferson, Iberia, and the Department of Integrative Biology at the University of California, Berkeley. And so it's so interesting the way we met. We met at a Northern California botanist meeting in 2018. I remembered in 2011, 2012, I was very much interested in doing some statistical analysis to be able to quantify or estimate species ranges for flora in Nigeria, and I couldn't do that. And so I was looking online, I was scanning through literature that is there no statistical analysis I could do on this? And then I stumbled on some work that was done by this professor in Australia called Sean Lafan. And I was in communication with him. He gave me a lot of information and tips on how to be able to do that. And then I couldn't do anything because in 2014, I was about to do something about it. I started my PhD, so I abandoned all of that independent studies. And then in 2018, I just met Brent Mishler. I was invited to give a talk at Northern California Botanist, and he was making reference to Sean Lafan and some of the work they did. And I was like, I know this guy. And then after the meeting, I just went to talk to Brent and introduce myself and had a conversation. And we just connected like chemistry, like that's the way I call it. Like he could see the passion that I have, because he knew that this is something I really have been looking forward to. I've been wanting to learn. It's my career passion. Biogeography, seeing what are the ecological or evolutionary or biogeographical processes that determine species ranges, that determines species distributions in time and space. And so it was like, well, we're doing something on spatial phylogenetics. And that was it. And so we started writing proposals to submit for postdoc, and eventually I got this one in 2021. And once I got that, I just quickly finished my PhD and moved on to start my postdoc at UC-Berkeley. And then you might be wondering what happened to my job at NatGraph. So when I started my PhD in 2014, I was still on the payroll of the institution in Nigeria. So I was made to sign some documents that I will travel here, do my research, and come back home. But what is so interesting is that they said I have to finish my PhD within 2 years. 2 years. If I don't do that and come back to my job, I will lose the job. So I told them there is no way on earth I can finish a PhD in the US within 2 years. And they said, well, that's the law. And so there's nothing they can do about it. They said, well, the law was written by a human being, not by God. And so those laws could be flawed. They are not in alignment with what is happening currently in the world. Even in Europe, you can't do 3-year PhD any longer. They're like 4 years or 5 years now, not to talk of in the US. But they said, well, that's what they can do. And so I ended up losing that job. And then, interestingly, they have not even communicated with me till today, but some of my colleagues over there told me that they have fired me from the job. And then I said, well, I'm going to sue them. I'm going to take them to court because it was not properly done. And then my colleagues, it was so interesting, and I'm going to say this, is that my colleagues said, well, the institution has not changed from the way I left it. That if I come back here, I will still have to be using my money to do research. There are no research facilities. There are no research funding. So it's not worth it, that I should not even bother myself wanting to fight for any right, that it's not worth it. And so I said, well, if that's the case, then that institution, it is their loss. If they fired me, because it is their loss, really. And so that's the story with that institution over there. Unfortunately, all the work I did there, published papers, none of them was funded by them. I just used my money to do research because I was really passionate about what I was doing. I really loved it, and so I was just using my money to do it. Anyways, so currently I'm very much interested in species division in time and space. There's eco-evolutionary underpinnings of community assemblages, species coexistence, and I'm really interested in working in both temperate and tropical ecosystems, and see what happens after 2 years of postdoc. What next? Is there another postdoc or get a job in the academia? I am very much passionate about doing research. I really want to be able to contribute to knowledge building, contribute to advancing scientific understanding. At the same time, the mentoring, the education that I didn't enjoy when I was in the university, I want people in the younger generation, I want them to experience that. I want them to not have to go through what I went through. I want them to have that proper capacity building so that they can discover who they are, they can discover their interest, they can discover their passion ahead of time and step into it without having to go through the meandering that I went through. So I'm really very much interested in research and mentoring, and I can spend time talking about my efforts in mentoring the younger generation. This is where I'm going to finish my talk. I hope I have not disappointed you with everything I've said. Maybe you wanted more information on something or less information on something. It's a little bit shy, and I'm a little bit flustered having to talk about myself. I'm a very shy person. I'm an introvert. So this has been very hard for me to do. So I hope I've been able to communicate effectively, communicate my unconventional career journey to what I am today and to who I am today. And I'm happy to connect with you all. You can email me, connect with me on ResearchGate or LinkedIn or any of these platforms, or just go on my website. And with that, I really want to appreciate you all for your time, for listening to me, and for this invitation. I'm very, very honored, and I'm very grateful for it. Thank you very much.